So, of course, I want to start by saying thank you, everyone, for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're talking about sketch patterns in Onshape. We're going to focus solely on all the ways that you can pattern geometry at the sketch level in Onshape. Really intended for those that are just getting started with Onshape, maybe trying to understand some of the sketch tools and sketch patterns in particular, and kind of how they behave. Now, as I always say with these webinars, we really encourage you to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions dialog in the GoToWebinar control panel. Feel free to ask any question, and I'll do my best to stop and address the questions from time to time as we're going through this. Now, this is going to be a short webinar. There's only a few ways that we have for patterning geometry, so I'm going to show you those and a few other related tips as well. So let's dig in. Now, the agenda today really kind of simple. Of course, we're going to introduce sketch patterns, linear and circular sketch patterns, and I also have a few other commands that I'd like to show you, but those are kind of the meat of today's webinar. So introduce sketch patterns, discuss techniques for patterning sketch entities, and what is going to drive the pattern, for example, or how do you want the pattern to behave, and then also show a few example patterns, of course. So as we're going through this, I have a few different examples of the different pattern types and also some other techniques that you might use for recreating sketch geometry. All right, so let's dig in. What are sketch patterns? And again, forgive me if you have a lot of exposure to CAD applications in the past. I'm sure you're aware of it. But sketch patterns, to be put simply, are patterns at the sketch level, patterns of sketch geometry. Lines, lines, circles, arcs, all those things that you're used to constructing at the sketch level. If you want to be able to pattern them, then this is what we're talking about here today. It's important to keep in mind, though, this does not include, we're not going to be talking about patterning features or patterning parts. We have done a different webinar on that, so definitely check out our YouTube channel if you're interested in past webinars on patterns. Today, we're focusing solely on patterning sketch entities. So, why would I need this? And the question is valid, and it gets asked a lot. Is why would I use a sketch pattern versus a feature pattern, or why would I use sketch patterns at all? And I think for a lot of users, they want to be able to repeat not the feature, but the actual sketch entities that drive them. And anytime you need to repeat sketch level geometry, you're going to need a sketch pattern tool of some sort. Now, it's important to point out a lot of what I'm going to show you here today can also be used, could also be created using a feature pattern. And, there is a lot of overlap between the two, a lot. And so, I would say for many users, it boils down to, in many situations, a matter of preference. And having everything in a sketch, a lot of users like it that way, and therefore use a lot of sketch patterns. But understand that, again, if you need to repeat geometry at the sketch level, then sketch patterns are the tools you're looking for. And I think the real thing is if you find yourself manually sketching the same thing over and over again, or similar shapes over and over again, and find yourself positioning them and rotating them and doing all these things to try and get them in the right spot, chances are there's a pattern tool that will allow that to be faster. It'll make it a little bit quicker. So, question, as in CATIA and others, I assume you may be referring to sketch patterns, and sketch patterns are a common thing in many CAD applications. CATIA, SolidWorks, Inventor, almost all professional 3D CAD applications have some level of sketch patterns, and I'm sure if you have familiarity with one of those applications, I'm sure a lot of this is going to look pretty similar. Do sketches have their own extensions? If you're referring to file extensions, the answer is no. There's no files whatsoever in Onshape. So, all right. So, what commands are available to us? And there are a few things that we are going to use for patterning geometry. And of course, I've already mentioned the first two. The most common are going to be linear and circular sketch patterns. And like the name implies, it allows you to pattern a sketch entity in a linear direction or pattern a sketch entity around a cylinder or a circular pattern. Now, the last one I want to mention is very valuable is mirror. And mirror is a particularly valuable one if you need to, of course, mirror sketch geometry across, not necessarily patterning it, but you want that symmetric behavior in your sketch. But I wanted to mention again any way that we have for recreating, reusing sketch data. So let's dig into it. Now, the first thing that I want to show is a linear sketch pattern. Okay, so we'll start. with this simple arm. And what I'd like to do is take a hole that I want to cut and pattern it all the way across this arm at a certain distance, a certain spacing, and so on. So let's discuss it now. I'm going to edit the sketch, edit sketch 1. You'll see it's just a simple circle located relative to this corner. And I'm going to take this circle and create a linear sketch pattern, patterning it across the arm. And there are some unique advantages that I have at doing this at the sketch level versus doing this at the feature level. So let me give you a quick example. I want to do a linear pattern. So you'll find, by the way, linear and circular pattern and transform all in the far right of the sketch toolbar here. And it's very simple. You select linear pattern, you click on the things that you want to pattern. So in this case, just the circle. Okay. Now, immediately when you click on the geometry or select the geometry that you want to pattern, you're going to be given these arrows and previews of the pattern. And you can see my direction is going this way, and I have a second direction down here, but you can grab these arrows and move them. All right, so I can grab these and move them, and you can see there are a few details that pop up when I do that. First off, I have a dimension here. I have a number of instances, 3x, a pattern of 3. And by the way, that does include the original, just a frequently asked question. So I have this drag arrow manipulator that I can grab and drag and change the distance between the instances. I can double click the number, right? Change the number of instances in the pattern very easily. So again, the idea is just simple space, the distance between each instance, and the number of instances. Now, a few things that I want to mention here. If I want to go a second direction, that's another very commonly asked question. If I want to take these holes and pattern them in a second direction, I want another row of holes, so to speak. How would I do that? And by default, in the linear sketch pattern, you also have a second manipulator, a second drag arrow going in the opposite direction. And if you left click and drag this, it will then assume that you want more than one instance in that direction and will pattern those as well. Okay, so a tip if you're looking to go in both directions with your sketch patterns, grab both arrows. The moment you click on that and drag that second arrow, it will assume you want a second instance to your pattern. Okay, so that's kind of the basics. You establish you have in both directions, I have a spacing between the instances and a number of instances in both directions. So I can establish that if I just wanted a simple, 1.5 between each instance and 5 instances, then, I'm there. But there's a lot of stuff that you can really do here that's particularly powerful. So, this is, I think, what a lot of users are looking for. Just a simple way of saying X amount, this many instances. But there's a lot more intelligence you can build into this. And I want to point something out here. As I start to get into bigger and bigger numbers, this may not necessarily behave the way I'd expect. You can see it's just using a fixed distance and instance count. And as I go to 7 instances, all of a sudden there are instances out here in space, right, that aren't going to have an impact or cause some feature to fail or so on. So what I want to point out here is there's a few ways that you can drive these patterns. So let me show you an example. We'll do, again, just drag this out. Let's say that I want 5 in both directions. Right? Now, same exact pattern as a moment ago. What I want to point out, though, is first, and probably one of the most important tips that I have, make sure to accept the pattern. Left click to accept it. That's a step that's easy to miss. In the linear and circular sketch pattern, the last step to accept either a linear or circular sketch pattern is to left click in empty space. Okay, so you'll see a little visual cue of that, and I'll show you this again in just a moment. But make sure once the pattern looks right, you have the values in that you want, left click to accept it. Now, the reason I bring this up is you can change this afterwards. So for instance, I can delete the 1.65 and dimension relative to this other end, for example, and say this should be 3. Right? The spacing will remain the same. So now instead of driving it by a dumb number, so to speak, just a 1.5, I'm saying I want 5 instances of these holes, and I want the end spacing to be 2.5. And oftentimes that's the things that you want to control, not necessarily the spacing between instances, but I need to make sure that there's a gap or a distance from the edge of the part of X, right? And you can see as I change this, all the pattern instances will shift. So it's still maintaining that pattern. It's just I'm not driving it by the distance between holes. I'm driving it based on the end distance of the pattern. And I think this, for a lot of users, makes a lot more sense in terms of design intent. It means that I can change the number of instances, and I don't have to worry about breaking, so to speak, the design, right? I don't have to worry about undoing. And another commonly asked question, is it possible to delete a single instance? Let's say that I have all these, but this one looks wrong. I can delete just that individual instance. Okay, just Windows select, just as if it were any other sketch geometry, and delete it. So again, you can treat them independently. Just Windows selecting and deleting does not impact the entire set, right? So if I change that distance, you'll see all the holes shift over, of course, except for the one that I deleted. So that's an important thing I want to point out. Again, you can drive the sketch pattern by more than just a simple distance and instance count. You can drive it by the edge of the part, for example. So just keep that in mind. Now, another thing I always like to mention, let's go ahead and get rid of these pattern instances here, is let's say that I don't necessarily want perfectly linear patterns, or I want to align it with something. So if I do that same linear pattern, let's grab and drag and go this way as well. So you have these arrows that allow you to establish direction, but you also have these squares at the end points of them, and you can grab these and manipulate the geometry further, right? So I can grab these points and kind of manipulate, flip back and forth, and grab, shift the pattern maybe along a different direction, right? Maybe I want it along an angle, going down, let's say. And remember that, these are just lines. So if I left click accept this, pattern, I can then constrain this line or dimension this line relative to something, and that will control the pattern. So you have, the ability to create patterns that are at different angles just by grabbing those lines and manipulating them, constraining them just like you would any other sketch entities, and attaching it to whatever you'd like. So just keep in mind, by default it will go back and forth along the X and Y axis, but you can grab those squares and just manipulate and change any direction you like, and then align the construction geometry that's created to something else that makes sense in your design. So again, just trying to drive home, you're not forced to go up and down, so to speak, or X and Y. It's any direction that you'd like. So that is the linear sketch pattern, and a few tips that I have for working with it. I see a few questions, so bear with me. Very far ahead, but is the linear sketch model convertible to other CAD software? You can export as a DXF. I'm not sure what other CAD software you're looking to go to, but you can export any sketches as a DXF, yes. Can you create the pattern with a distance from a different feature from the initial pattern? Do you have to accept it and then edit? You have to hit left click to accept it, but then just delete the dimension that drives it and change it to something else, like the example I showed you. So you do have to left click to accept. I think I'm understanding you correctly. By default, it will assume that you just want a certain distance between the holes and a certain instance count. And I think that's what a lot of users are looking for. But yeah, you have to left click accept, delete the dimension that drives the distance, and then replace it with something else. Question, can you drive the pattern by a total length of the pattern? Yeah, you should be able to select the two end points of the pattern. I can try that in just a bit, so bear with me. I know you can drive it relative to other geometry. I haven't tried end point to end point, but I don't see why it wouldn't. Okay, can I get the deleted item back? Can I get the... Oh, I'm sorry. When you delete an instance of it, the only thing that we would have there would be an undo. So the undo in the top left, or Command Z, Control Z, or whatever it may be. Okay. So that is a simple example of a linear sketch pattern What I'd like to walk you through next is an example of a circular sketch pattern. Okay, so let's jump into that. Now, the big thing here, as you can imagine, is instead of patterning in a single direction relative to some reference, I'm rotating sketch entities around. I'm patterning them around an axis. So let's walk through this. Now, the example I often give is a bolt circle. And, oftentimes users have a scenario where, I have this 4-hole bolt circle on the back of this part, maybe for a spanner wrench or something like that, where I need to define 4 evenly spaced holes around a circle. So let's walk through this. I'll edit the sketch. And you can see right now it's just one bolt circle. Right? I need to take and pattern 3 more of these to get a total of 4 that are evenly spaced around this cylinder. Now, real simple, I start with a circular pattern, same place where linear pattern was just a moment ago. So right underneath it, you'll find circular pattern. And I left click the geometry I want to pattern. Right? Left click, and you'll see immediately I get 2 more holes for a total instance count of 3. Now, a few things that I want to mention. By default, when you do any circular pattern at the sketch level, it's going to assume that the center of that pattern is the origin. But you can grab this and move it anywhere you'd like. Right? So by default, it's assumed that the center of this pattern would be the origin, but I can move this around and say, okay, that's the actual center of my pattern. That's one of the first tips that I want to point out. Very important when it comes to positioning and defining, fully defining the circular sketch pattern. So again, make sure to grab that center point of the pattern preview, move it around until it's attached to whatever it should be attached to, right? Then, of course, it's no different than before. You can set your spacing. Instance. In this case, I want 4. Right, so I want 4, and remember, all of them include the original. So now I have 4 evenly spaced holes for my bolt circle. Now, the question often comes up, by default, it does 360 degrees. But what if I don't want, 4 over 360 degrees? What if I wanted 4 over 180 degrees? Or something to that effect. And the answer is you can change this. You'll see an arrow here. And if I left click and drag this, I can change this angle to anything I'd like, right? So there's 4 over 180 degrees. By default, it will assume that you want to do full 360, so evenly spaced over 360 degrees, but you can change that number to anything that you'd like, right? Just grab the arrow, you can double click and enter the number into the dimension here, and that will drive your circular sketch pattern. Okay, so a big tip, you don't necessarily have to define over a full 360 degree pattern. Okay. Now, I mentioned this before, and it's also important here in both linear and circular sketch patterns. It is very important to left click to accept them. So that's the final step in the pattern. You'll notice if I just hit escape or if I hit any other button here, I lose out. I get out of that circular sketch pattern command. So in the dialog or in the Windows graphic, you'll see a little mouse icon, and the left cursor, the left button there, is highlighted. So left click, that accepts the pattern. Okay, very important last step. I think a lot of new users can miss in both linear and circular sketch pattern. Make sure to left click that one last time to accept everything. Now I can go from here, of course, do extrude, remove, let's say 0.25. Okay. And now I've added my bolt circle. So just trying to drive home again, circular sketch pattern, make sure to move that center point to a position that makes sense for you. By default, when you do a circular sketch pattern, it's going to assume that the center of the pattern, the rotation point of that pattern, is the origin. And chances are in your design it may not be. So you may have to move that around and position it as such. But otherwise, very simple. Again, you can pattern over a full 360. That's the default, but then you can also pattern over any angle that you want. All right, so we've discussed linear sketch pattern, circular sketch pattern. The other important piece to recreating geometry very quickly is the mirror command. And the mirror command, while just a bit different than patterns, is a fast way to create a lot of sketch geometry. And it's a technique that a lot of users apply because it also gives you symmetry in your sketch. And the example I always like to give is, if I'm designing a revolve profile, maybe this is a pulley of some sort, and I need to start defining the actual symmetry between my profile. I want to make sure that this half matches perfectly with this half. They're symmetric about the middle. And the way we accomplish that is with a mirror. Right? Now, mirror is very simple. You select mirror, you click the line you want to mirror about, then click on anything that you want to mirror. Right? You can window select, so if you have a lot of geometry, you can do it all at once. But very simple. Select your mirror line, select any entities that you want to mirror. So the big thing that this gives you is now when I change the length, for instance, on one, they both update. Right? I get that symmetry behavior between the sketch entities. Now you can recreate this using a symmetric constraint, but I think a lot of users like the ability to mirror geometry over and get that symmetry that's experienced with it. So that is a simple example of mirror, but very easy to use. Select your mirror line, select anything that you want to mirror, it will mirror it to the other side. You do get symmetry between the entities after they've been mirrored. Okay, so forgive me, I see a few questions here. Bear with me for just 1 second. Questions. You can pattern points. Yes, there's no issues with patterning points. You can mirror points just the same as what I've shown you up to this point. Can you sketch individual instances of a pattern for different extrude or cut values? You can take a single sketch. You can use any piece of a sketch to extrude. So what I would do, and forgive me if I'm misunderstanding, but still pattern the sketch level and then just do several extrudes for each different depth that you've defined. But you can still drive multiple extrudes from a single sketch, absolutely. How about mirror without copy? I do not believe we have that. No, there's no way as of that I know of to mirror without copying. Can you copy sketches to different planes? Can you copy sketched features to different planes? The answer is yes, and that kind of takes us into the next topic that I want to discuss. Now, up to this point, the commands I've shown you are really patterns, ways of patterning geometry, mirror included, right? We're patterning geometry about a mirror line. But, there are a lot of times that it may not necessarily I need a pattern, but I need to copy and paste, or I need to reuse sketch entities in some way. And so I want to get into a few kind of miscellaneous tips that I have for positioning geometry at the sketch level, whether that be copy and pasting or transform or so on. So just a few miscellaneous tips, so bear with me. The first is transform. Transform doesn't pattern the geometry, but it allows you to easily position the geometry relative to some other thing, or just move it around. If you've ever wanted to take, your dozen lines and arcs and rotate it 90 degrees, or if you've ever wanted to take your entire sketch, flip it upside down, and position it 2 inches to the left, that's a great example of transform. Transform will allow you to do that. So it's not patterning it necessarily, but you're taking an entire sketch and positioning it relative to your part. Now, there's two other things that I want to mention here as well, and this is tying back to the question I just got a moment ago. Copy and paste. Can you copy sketched features to different planes? And the answer is yes. You can copy and paste a sketch, and you can copy and paste individual sketch entities. So I don't have to necessarily copy the entire sketch. I can window select a piece of my sketch and then copy just that piece and paste it anywhere I'd like. Now, important to point out, with the last two that I've mentioned, copy and paste sketch entities, they do not update when the original changes. And that is an important thing to point out. If you want behavior where it updates when the original changes, you need to use the derived feature to accomplish that. Copy and paste, simple copy and paste does not update the original. So we have both options. I think a lot of users out there don't necessarily want everything driven from a single sketch, but there are other users that absolutely do. So if you're looking for updating behavior when I change the original all copied instance update, you need to use the derived feature. But if you're looking for just simple copying and pasting of sketch entities, these two commands will work. All right, so let's get into it now. The first example I want to discuss, again, isn't really a pattern. It's more about positioning geometry. It's just something that I always like to point out. It's right there under the pattern commands. So part of the reason I like to bring it up. So under linear pattern, circular pattern, there's transform. And like the name implies, you can transform geometry. So I select transform, I window select the thing that I want to transform, all the geometry I want to move, even though it's constrained by other things, right? That sketch was attached to the middle of the part, and it was constrained relative to a lot of other external geometry, the faces and edges. It's still able to transform, and it'll snap to 90-degree increments. I can grab this and move it up. So the big thing that I want to point out again is, even though my sketch was constrained relative to that position, relative to the orientation and so on, it's still allowed to be transformed. And if I left click and accept it, it then becomes easy for me to start to replace the constraints and so on. So, if you ever just need to take a sketch entity, whatever you have, and move it or rotate it and then reposition it, transform will allow you to do that. Okay. Sorry, I see there was an issue with the screen updating. Let me do that one more time. So right underneath linear and circular pattern, circular pattern, you have transform. And here I have a sketch that's, fixed. It's completely defined. I want to take this sketch, shift it over, and rotate it. I can select transform, select the geometry I want to transform, and you'll see the manipulators. Right, I can grab, drag, rotate. There's 90 degrees right there. And so I can manipulate this geometry. Again, even though it was fully constrained in its current position, the transform command allows me to then move it. It will automatically break any constraints that were causing an issue. And when I accept, it's easy for me to go back in and position the geometry the way I want, right? Add the constraints that I need. So that is the transform command. You'll find it under linear and circular pattern right here. And it's just a matter of window selecting the sketch entities that you want, and then using the manipulator, drag, arrows, and rotation to rotate and move it. And I know it's not a pattern, but it's under the pattern tools, and I think it's common for those doing a lot of patterning. So that's transform, and that's one of the ways to position a sketch. Now, the question often comes up, well, what if I wanted to copy this sketch and paste it onto a different plane? Or what if I wanted to copy this sketch and even paste another instance over here somewhere, even within the same sketch? So there are two techniques, and I mentioned them: copy and paste sketch, copy and paste sketch entities. So let's go over copy and paste sketch first. I'm going to accept this. And let's just say hypothetically that I want to take this sketch 5 and I want to paste it onto this face, right? So I right click. You'll see in the right click option a copy sketch, right? Right click copy sketch, right click a face or any plane for that matter, and you'll see paste sketch. Now, it's not going to come in the correct orientation, and this is where transform and constraining it are going to be useful. But now I have that sketch where I can do a quick transform, rotate it around, whatever it is that I'm trying to do. Maybe just attach the end to the edge of the part here. Okay, and bring these two together. Remember, not constrained to the original. So this is now an independent sketch that I've positioned. It just happened to be copied from a past sketch. So green check, OK. Now I've copied this sketch onto this face. Okay. Again, not linked in any way, but a useful way of reusing sketch entities. Right-click copy, right-click a plane or a planar face, and choose paste sketch. All right, so that's copy and paste sketch. Now, the last thing that I wanted to mention here today is copy and paste sketch entities. And this is particularly important for the users that are looking for something that may not necessarily be an evenly spaced pattern or something to that effect, where, I have this geometry and I want to pattern it, but I want to pattern it in kind of random positions, and nothing that's clearly driving it. And the way you can accomplish this is just selecting the things that you want to copy, right? Right click on it. You'll see copy sketch entities. Then right click where you want to paste those sketch entities and you'll see paste sketch entities. Now, as soon as you do this, it assumes that you also want to transform. So immediately after you paste, you're going to see these transform arrows, which give you the same transform capabilities that we were looking at a second ago. Right? So this is the same command, again, we were checking out a second ago, but it's just built on top of copy and paste. And it's a useful way for me to come in and say, okay, there's a copy of that rotated over 90 degrees and shifted. Right? Now I can come in and add the constraints that I really need to attach this. So just keep in mind, copy and paste sketch entities will give you these scenarios where you are reusing the sketch to a certain degree, but it's not necessarily something you could easily circular pattern or linear pattern. I just reuse the same kind of profile in different places. So copy and paste sketch entities is really big for that, and definitely want to recommend if you're doing any kind of manipulation to reusing that same series of sketch entities over and over. Okay, so I see a few questions, and I'm going to stick around and answer all questions, but that's really what I had planned for you. If you have any outstanding questions, please stick around. If you have any questions that I haven't answered, please ask them in the questions dialog in your GoToWebinar control panel. But that's really what I had planned. I want to say thank you, everyone, and have a good day.